This demo consists of 3 parts, in which different roles and trustee personas participate. In the first part, the demonstration shows how the trustee platform can be extended with new data domains in addition to the 5 default ones that are currently supported. That is, energy, health, education, automotive, and space. In this demo, the domain bank_details will be onboarded to trustee. In the second part, the demonstration presents the registration of a dataset under this newly onboarded domain. And in the third part, it is showcased how this newly registered dataset can be searchable within trustee and considered for confidential computations. In the first part, the certification authority that is responsible for new domain creation is trustee, which is why a certification authority user is used for logging into the system. Once inside, the certification authority needs to go to the new domain onboarding section in the left menu and just complete the details about the new domain, name, description, and the list of attributes/metadata that will characterize the datasets of the specific domain. In this case, clear or confidential attributes, hashed attributes, that will be encrypted and remain confidential for the attributes verifiers can be defined. The certification authority makes the submission, and all this information about the new domain will be registered in the trustee data lake. Once the domain has been created in trustee, the certification authority can issue credentials to different trustee data providers to characterize their datasets and make them searchable in trustee. For this purpose, the certification authority needs to use the self-sovereign identity homomorphic encryption-capable framework issuer subcomponent of trustee, which needs to be locally deployed at the authority's premises. The first step in this case is to create the domain itself and all the self-sovereign identity-related data for the new domain. For this purpose, it needs to define the name of the domain, the version, and the attributes that have also been defined in the trustee dashboard. Once the information is included, the credential schema, the credential definition, and finally the domain are created. The certification authority can see this new domain in the list of available domains of the certification authority. Now that the domain has been correctly created, the certification authority can issue credentials to trustee data providers. Here, the credential issuance process is shown. The certification authority selects the new domain, the identifier of the trustee data provider the credential will be issued to, and it provides a value for each defined attribute for the new domain. As a result, a credential has been correctly issued to a trustee data provider. At any moment, a trustee data provider can check the credentials he has related to all the datasets he owns. For this, he can use the self-sovereign identity homomorphic encryption-capable framework, holder subcomponent, where he can list the received credentials, including the certified attributes for the different domains, the 5 already existing in trustee as well as the new one. There is an option that allows the deciphering of the credential attributes in order to check the value of even encrypted attributes. For the second part of this demo, once the data provider has a credential for the characterization of a specific dataset, they can proceed with the registration of the dataset in trustee as part of trustee's distributed data sources. For this purpose, the data provider needs to authenticate in the system using their own identity, in this case, John Smith. Once authenticated, the data provider needs to go to the Provide Data section. Here, the data provider can see the complete process they need to follow to securely register the dataset and make it searchable and usable in computations. In this case, This user has already done the first two steps in advance, deploying some local components and registering the endpoints in Trustee. The data provider can check them in the account page of the user, checking the endpoints they have provided for the search process, as well as for the computations. For this reason, the data provider will proceed now with the rest of the steps, starting with the definition of the dataset itself. It should be clarified here that only the description of the dataset is provided and stored in the data lake of Trustee, while the dataset itself remains at the premises of the data provider. In the dataset description form, the first field refers to the credential identifier that will characterize the specific dataset to register. This can be obtained from the self-sovereign identity homomorphic encryption-capable framework holder subcomponent. The data provider also needs to provide a name for the dataset and the source type, in this case, Trustee. There are three additional options, including Copernicus, Gaia-X, and IDS, as Trustee includes connectors to these three data spaces, and it is possible to consider datasets from them in Trustee. Then, the user needs to define the domain, the dataset size, the number of rows or records, and an open description with any information considered interesting and useful. The following section refers to the location of the dataset, that is, if it is publicly available, this is not the case now, and the validity of the dataset inside Trustee. The following section refers to the attributes by which the dataset could be searched, which need to be related to the attributes from the credential characterization of the dataset. Finally, the data provider needs to fill in the data structure section, which defines the column name, position, and value type. In particular, this section is usually complex to fill, as many datasets have several columns. In this case, a dataset with 7 different columns is considered. For this reason, the data provider can use the Trustee virtual assistant for automating this process. At this point, it is important to select the dataset whose structure will be automatically filled and wait for some seconds or minutes for the virtual assistant to complete the process. Once all the columns have been defined, the user can make a submission, and all these details will be recorded inside the Trustee data lake. As expected, a message indicating that no similar datasets are available is presented in the dashboard, as this is the first dataset registered for the new domain. Once the dataset description form is completed, the data provider needs to proceed with the data provider agreements creation. Before the agreements are created, the data provider needs to complete the GDPR compliance self-assessment. There are several questions that need to be carefully completed by the data provider to identify the risk of non-compliance with GDPR. In this case, for demo purposes, dummy answers are provided, but the data provider needs to provide suitable answers to the different questions. Once the survey is completed, the data provider needs to continue with the privacy impact assessment process, which is also a quite long survey, considering the description of the processing operations, their necessity, the risks involved, and the measures taken to mitigate these risks. For demo purposes, the dev skip option is considered, but in a real registration process, the data provider needs to complete the entire assessment. Once the two surveys are completed, it is time to complete the agreement. The data provider needs to provide a name for the agreement, while they can see the identifier of the dataset they are registering, and then they can provide open details or commentaries. The user also needs to select a suitable license, indicate if the dataset contains personal data, the validity of the agreement, if internal policies apply, the legal basis, for example, consent, and the purpose, in this case, research. The data provider then sees the domain, and they need to confirm users from which countries are allowed to use the dataset, the level of confidentiality, if the dataset can be fused, if it is accurate, if results stemming from the use of the dataset can be stored in trustees' knowledge repository for other users to view them, the target audience, the collection methods, and if any ISO standard applies. The final section of the agreement refers to the allowed computations for the dataset, based on the column definition from the first step. For this reason, in this case, the data provider can select among the domain-agnostic operations of trustee, suitable for each of the columns based on their data type. Finally, a summary of the GDPR compliance the data provider has filled before is shown. With this, the agreement has been finally completed and can be generated and signed. Once this process has been completed, the dataset is considered registered in trustee, and the data provider is automatically redirected to the My Datasets section in the trustee dashboard, where all their registered datasets are shown, as is the case with the one just registered. Clicking the I button, the provided description details can be checked. Moving to the third part of this demo, once datasets are registered in Trustee, they can be searched and considered in a computation by a Trustee data consumer. For this purpose, a data consumer needs to authenticate themselves in Trustee using their own identity and go to the Use Data section. Here, the process to be followed for executing computations in Trustee is showcased. In this case, a data consumer user who has already deployed and registered the required local components in advance has been considered, as it can be checked on the account page of the user. So, the data consumer can now proceed with the rest of the flow, starting with the confidential search definition, in which they need to provide a name or identifier, as well as the values of the required attributes/metadata. For example, in this demo, it is assumed that the data consumer is interested in datasets from the new domain, whose location is Bilbao and whose bank is Santander. A search query submission is made, and a search operation is performed by the self-sovereign identity homomorphic encryption-capable framework of Trustee, making automatic requests and comparisons among all Trustee data providers about the attributes/metadata of their registered datasets. The attributes from the credentials, both clear or encrypted, are compared with the target values defined by the data consumer in the search query. As a result, the list of suitable datasets is shown considering the defined target values for characterization attributes. The data consumer selects the datasets they want to consider for their computation among those available. The next step refers to the selection of available computations and columns for the dataset, where the computation will be applied, according to the agreements generated by the data provider of this dataset. Here, the available computation is statistics, which computes the mean, variance, and standard deviation of the values included in the amount column of the selected dataset. Finally, the consumption agreements also need to be signed by the data consumer. For this purpose, the data consumer first checks that the GDPR compliance check and the privacy impact assessment are completed for the selected dataset. At this moment, they also need to complete the GDPR compliance self-assessment. In this case, dummy data are provided, but the data consumer needs to analyze in detail the questions and answers they provide to obtain a suitable risk score. Once completed, the consumption agreement can be signed by the data consumer, and then they may proceed with the process. The data consumer finally sees a summary of the steps that have been followed so far, including the search request, the selected dataset, and the selected computation. If everything is correct, the data consumer can initiate the computation, which happens inside the homomorphic encryption data fusion component of Trustee. This process usually takes a long time, depending on the dataset size and the selected computation complexity. But in this case, for demo purposes, a short dataset with 100 lines is used. At any time, the data consumer can check the status of the computation inside the My Results page in the dashboard. The data consumer needs to check until the computation is completed. Once completed, the data consumer can check the results by pressing the I button.